his body got stolen from the back of the hearse. Somebody's stolen the hearse and Seth's dead. And they're like, what? He's killed him? And I'm like, no, he's already dead. When my 3-year-old sister died, her photograph was taken out of the house and she was never spoken about again. I was starting to acknowledge just how death illiterate the communities I was living in were, and people finding it really hard to talk about death and dying.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today I'm speaking with Hayley West. Hayley West describes herself on her LinkedIn bio, it's very intriguing, as a multi-potentialite. I lead a diverse life embracing roles as a librarian, artist, death literacy advocate, radio presenter, student and parent. I am also aspiring to be a doom metal vocalist to the mix. I love that intro. I have never seen such a good intro on a LinkedIn bio. Thank you for being with us, Hayley.
No problem. Thanks for finding that little snippet.
Now tell me, of all of the hats that you seem to describe and wear in that particular bio, I have heard you speak about your arts practice, and I am fascinated by the different projects that you've done over time. So tell me, what attracted you to death? What led you to be an artist? Tell me how it all started, Hayley.
Well, I've been creative my whole life, I guess, and I did study formally at RMIT. I studied sculpture, and I guess it started there really in that formal training at a university where we didn't have the luxury of a lot of open space and separate studio spaces. It was like we were in a classroom together, like 20 of us in a room in the middle of Melbourne CBD. And so we had to...
Open plan before it became...
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. When we looked at VCA over on the other side, in South Melbourne, the kind of St Kilda area, they had beautiful grounds and, nice individual studios, and, we're always very jealous of that. But it really made us think a little bit more conceptually about the work that we were creating, and the engagement that we had with each other was very close contact. But when we had to present work, it was like on the rooftop, in the bathroom, in kilns or around pillars, or we had to really kind of think outside the square when we were presenting. And it really made a lot of our practices become quite interesting. And I guess death had kind of already started appearing in my work, because at that point as well, Dad had died, which was my first, well, I'd had quite a few deaths before that, but that was a really significant death for me in 1995. And that was around the time, just before I started at RMIT. So I started noticing that the theme of death was kind of creeping in, although there was a theme of love and sex as well. So there was kind of all, like a bit of taboo things going on, people weren't really talking about death a lot back in the 90s. And so I guess from that point, that was where I started to really think about art as not so much, even though I was studying sculpture, not so much about an object making path I was taking. It really was something, I was creating works that were ephemeral or interactive, or it had the option for people to interact with it or contribute to it as well. One of the works that I did, I had a really dodgy job when I was studying. I was working for pre-internet for a dating agency.
Oh, wow.
It was fascinating. And there was a variety of jobs I had to do. I won't go into them all. But one of them involved pre-recording messages and leaving messages for men who were interested in particular women. And in my case, I was a different person in each state of Australia. was very dodgy. But there was one person who kept calling me and singing to me and leaving singing messages. And so I turned it into an artwork. So I recorded myself singing the same songs into a phone, and then I merged them together like we were singing duets.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that was one of my graduating artworks. And so people would come into the space and they'd have to lift up the telephone, like an old school telephone, and call a particular number, and then they would hear our duets. Yeah, and I did end up trying to meet him.
Oh, wow, that is so cool. Did you?
No, he never turned up. I took another fellow art student under the clocks, Flinders Street Station.
How very traditional of you.
Yeah, and he was going to be wearing a particular, I can't remember, probably a blue flanny or something, it was grunge time. And I took a friend to take photographs of, people that he could see and me for a bit of protection as well. But yeah, he never turned up. Or he did, and he saw me and chickened out. Who knows? Anyway, so I've been interested in artworks that are, have that interactive kind of quality, I guess. That's where it started.
And one of the artworks that is very vividly in my head was when you presented the one where you involved your daughter.
Oh, the video work.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I'd done a couple of little video works with her before. When I was living in the Blue Mountains, I lived in Darwin for 8 years. And then we decided to move to the Blue Mountains. And I've always really loved the religious grotto spaces, devotional grottos around the world. There's particularly in Catholic countries. Anyway, in the Blue Mountains.
Yeah, they're all over Italy.
Yes. In the Blue Mountains, there's some really strange, kooky ones, that were built post-war by ex-servicemen coming back from the war, and the council or whoever at the time decided that they wanted to build these picnic huts, but they're really ugly. They're concrete grottos and they're just like picnic huts basically, but they kind of have a fake kind of rock formation around them, and I just loved them. I thought they were so great, and I started up a blog actually, Blue Mountains Grotto Love. Anyway, when we left Darwin, I really missed Darwin, and I found the Blue Mountains quite hard. A whole nother set of new deaths happened, and the family was struggling a little bit with that, and also we were struggling to find work. An extended family were struggling to find work as well. And so I had this kind of real longing for Darwin, and I didn't know anyone really in New South Wales. So I found it difficult to make friends. I had a small child who I was pretty much looking after myself at the time. And so I just came up with this idea. I wanted to do an artwork in the grottos, and I kind of roped Ramona, my daughter, into a couple of other artworks that I'd done with her. And I just had this vision of wrapping her in all the Indonesian sarongs and different longis from our travels around Southeast Asia, because, I think I was thinking about shrouds and how they're usually white sheets, but I had these sarongs I kept hanging on to even though I was living in a really cold climate. And so, yeah, it was quite interesting because I was lying down on the table in the grotto, and I had a couple of friends who were videoing, and I had my stepdaughter Asha also kind of helping with Ramona. But I didn't really have an idea in mind. I just knew that she was going to wrap me in sarongs. But what I didn't realize was just that situation where you actually don't have any control over what happens. And she was only 3 at the time, 3 or 4. And so Asha was directing her to wrap me, and I was lying very still, like I was pretending to be dead. And she'd, move her little chair around and kind of keep wrapping me. And I had to kind of give up the artistic control. And also it was getting videoed as well. So I didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't really have any direction either. And the grotto was at the side of a big lake too. So they actually got into the lake at one point and did a far away shot as well. And so it became this really interesting work for me. about the connection between mother and daughter, kind of talking to children as well about death and how at a certain age they start to question death and their own mortality. And, my mother had died when I was in Darwin as well. I think she died in 2007. And yeah, so it became a real artwork about mother and daughter and kind of disengaging yourself from your child, at a certain age where they start to not need you as much. And so it was a real kind of grief piece as well. And then at the end, I'd collected it was a 30-year cycle of cicadas coming to the Blue Mountains, and it was like a mass exoskeleton like party on the streets. They were everywhere. So I collected hundreds and hundreds of them. Anyway, Ramona at the end of the video is kind of throwing them into the water. So it's this kind of metamorphosis, kind of symbolism as well.
Oh, wow, that's really beautiful.
Yeah, so that was a really great work to make, and just the result of it, of watching it and seeing it for the first time and working with the film producers who edited it for me too, thank goodness. And just it was very, not much sound to it. There's a bit of bird sound, I think, but that was quite profound, that work. I loved it. I kept thinking I'd like to do more works with her as she got older, but the kind of, life gets in the way.
That's very true. And how old is she now?
14.
Okay, so you're not quite at that stage where she's starting to separate, but not fully there yet.
Yeah, she's pretty independent. I mean, we are now in Castlemaine. The kids are off doing all, their own thing, really. And it's such a small town. I mean, my ex-husband and I, we separated after we got to Castlemaine because Castlemaine's such a great place. It's like it's beautiful visually. I think after living in Darwin and living in the Blue Mountains, they were quite similar environmentally, even though they're the complete opposite extreme weather. But I felt very claustrophobic. Like Darwin towards the end was, the tropics, and, you couldn't breathe. You had this amount of, oxygen sometimes in October, this time of year, where it's the build up after the dry and before the wet. And then we moved to the Blue Mountains, and it was like mist was in front of you, like a meter in front. You couldn't see through it. And it was like this really dense environments I'd been living in for over 10 years. And so the next place we moved to was, my suggestion was Castlemaine, because I still have a brother who's living, and he lives in Melbourne. And I was like, let's move to Castlemaine. I just want to see through the gum trees. Like I can't, I need space. Like,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's really, really dense. I so understand what you're talking about, because I remember we were in Darwin July last year, and I was just so thankful that we weren't there in that kind of this period now, in this build up to the wet again, because I cannot stand humidity. And the density of the bush around the Blue Mountains, it is dense, isn't it? Like, it's really dense.
People get lost in there like 3 steps in.
Yeah. So tell me more about your arts practice, because I really remember the vivid colour and the contrast of the beautiful saris and sarongs that you were using in that particular one. But that's not the only one where you've used a lot of colour as well, is it? Like, I love the structure that you made out of everyday materials found in cemeteries. Like, that was just amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's actually a nice segue from that video work, because I came back to the grotto kind of structure. So when it was a few years after I'd moved here, I had this idea. Well, I joined a cemetery trust. That was the other thing I did. I joined a cemetery trust here in Castlemaine, which I was on for 5 years. And there's a lot of picking up of artificial flowers that, you either put them back if you know where they've come from on a grave, but there's a stack that just gets blown off into the bush. And so I spent a period of 8 months like going around to different cemeteries and cleaning up the bushland on the outskirts of the bush cemeteries. So I collected all these artificial flowers that were once, a memorial for someone. But now I decided to make them into a collective memorial for all those people that kind of had been part of every single flower, like that somebody had laid on their grave. I created this grotto structure where you, out of the artificial flowers, so you could actually get inside it. And, it has an opening at the front. And I first showed it in Ballarat as part of a festival there. And it stunk a little bit, actually, like because a lot of those flowers were really manky. So I ended up going to see a witch in Kangaroo Flat. There's a witch who's up there. There's a lot of witchy kind of business that goes on around central Victoria. There's Mount Franklin as well, Leanne. Yeah, the pagans go up there and do various things on top of the mountain. But yeah, so I went and saw this witch in Kangaroo Flat, and I said, people are going to go into this memorial space, and I told her what it was made up of, and she said, "Oh, I need to make something that kind of is, doesn't encourage any bad juju." So she created this scent for me that I put all over it, which was nice, except when I accidentally spilt it in my glove box, and like for the next 5 years I smell it.
Oh, wow.
It's a really beautiful work. It's had a couple of visits to art parties there used to be some art parties here called Chavou, and it was part of, people have performed inside it. It only fits one person or two people, but it's also been on the island for the Castlemaine State Festival, the island at our botanical gardens here, which was interesting because you couldn't actually get to it, but you could see it from afar. So it was kind of like this curious, what the hell's that doing there on an island? So I kind of liked that idea that you actually couldn't interact with it as well. Like,
Yeah, because so much of your work does involve that interaction, doesn't
yeah.
it?
And as you mentioned as well, color, like I don't know how that kind of came into it because I wear black mainly. It's like I express myself through my artwork. But yeah, like,
Yep.
yeah, I do love seeing people interact with artwork. Even when I've made static objects, there's still like an element of touch, or, like I had an ongoing project for a while that was collecting handmade vessels, ceramic vessels from op shops, that somebody had hand built. A lot of the time it's kids or somebody's pottery lesson or whatever. It ends up in the op shop. So I collected them, and then I created ceramic lids for them and turned them into cremation urns. And so they had a new life again. It was like I was kind of saving them from being discarded by whoever, family members. Yeah, and I did one exhibition with them which had a whole lot of death iconography from the Egyptian symbolism, the Book of the Dead. Yeah. So yeah, and I did a few commissions as well for other people's pets. And somebody came to me once with 2 vessels that they'd found that they really liked and said, "Look, we found matching ones for our matching dogs that died." So I created like a beautiful lids for those too. So even though they're kind of static objects, like they still have ashes inside them, and they, you still take the lid off and you interact. And I guess other works I've done for my masters. So when I was in the Blue Mountains and I was having a pretty terrible time, I decided I would actually delve deeper into the whole death industry. And the idea was actually to do my master's in visual arts because I couldn't find a job. And then I ended up getting an Australian postgraduate scholarship, which fed the family, for 2 years. So that was awesome. And I still wanted to maintain a connection to Darwin as well. So I did it through Charles Darwin University. But yeah, and then I decided at that point, it's like, I'm going to really like delve deeply into the whole death industry because I've noticed that it's kind of been appearing in my artwork for a while. And yeah, so I started researching because it was a master's by research as well. I started researching, and that's where I came across Death Cafe and what a death cafe was, and kind of became quite intrigued about that because my family was always death denial family. Like nobody ever talked about death.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like when my 3-year-old sister died, her photograph was taken out of the house and she was never spoken about again.
Wow. And how old were you when that happened?
6.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you just like lost your sister and she
Mm.
was completely removed from
Mm.
existence.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's so many stories like through my life of coming to the realization of certain things that happened during my lifetime at later stages. You know, like I'd
Yeah.
kind of blocked that out because the family had blocked it out, I guess. And, you know, I had a young uncle who just immigrated to Australia and he died in a drink driving accident when he was 21. So that was the next death. And that too was like too devastating for anybody to come to terms with. So didn't talk about him, Peter. And then I had a grandparent who died suddenly when I was in my teens as well, and nobody quite knew what happened. Wasn't talked about. You know, it just kept going. And I had a friend who died by suicide when I was in high school. And, you know, death has just followed me basically all through my life, I guess. So when I came across Death Cafe, I was like, oh my God, people want to talk about this? Like, this is insane. Like, what are you going to talk about? Oh my God, I've got to go. So,
And maybe if you can explain for those of
yeah,
us who are not aware of death cafes,
yep.
what it is, how it started, what
Mm.
the fascination is, what you get to do with them, that would be great.
Yes, Death Cafes started in the UK and it was created from a model that was already existing in Switzerland at the time. And John Underwood is the founder of Death Cafes. So he created his own version for mainly English speaking countries and Western countries. And he actually died a few years ago, which was interesting with the whole who was going to take over
Yeah.
running the whole shebang. Yeah, so it's really has taken off, and I think it was about 10 years ago it started, maybe even more. And so it's hosted in so many countries around the world now, particularly I think, you know, America, England and Australia really are they're quite strong movements. And yeah, so when I first discovered a death cafe in the Blue Mountains, it led me to Kerry Noonan, who was living in the Blue Mountains at the time. And she's quite an instrumental person in the whole deathy movement. And she would be an excellent person to interview. She's still in New South
Yes.
Wales.
She's has to be booked in for November.
Yeah. Oh,
Yes, so she's going to be a guest.
oh, great. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I met Kerry. Like, she was my first kind of real deathy that I met. And she was co hosting the Blue Mountains Death Cafes. And I remember, like, I can still visualize it when I was sitting there and sitting very quietly, trying to be quiet and listening to people's stories. And it was just so refreshing for me because I was so young too when my first parent died. I was in my 20s. It was very unusual, and I didn't have any friends who had gone through that, who was around me at that time. And then even when my second parent died, that was unusual too. You know, I was in my 30s. So for me to find other people just to talk to about anything to do with death was just, it was like a revelation. It really changed a whole lot of things for me. And meeting Kerry, and I ended up co-hosting the Death Cafes with Kerry actually when I was living there. I think I was there for 3 years in Blue Mountains.
We'll definitely include the links to the Death Cafe on
Yeah.
the show notes.
Mm.
And you mentioned that it changed a lot of things for you. What were those things that it changed, Hayley?
I guess talking to people about things that had happened to me personally, which I was pretty open about anyway, but I kind of I was starting to acknowledge just how death illiterate the communities I was living in were, you know, and people finding it really hard to talk about death and dying. And I think it kind of really not that I ever wanted to get into grief counseling, but it kind of really opened my eyes to the fact that I was not the only one who was really struggling with getting the words together to say the right thing, or to, you know, just be more informed about options. And I think, while I was there too, my brother-in-law died by suicide, and I organized his funeral when I was there. And, by that stage, I had my favorite funeral director who I'd befriended, Amy, and Victoria Spence I knew from my art circles. So I got her involved because it was quite a traumatic death as well. And there was children and involved, and not dead, but, he had small kids, and we had that situation where it was like, we never talked to Seth about what he wanted. He had tried to kill himself a number of times, but nobody had ever asked him if he actually went through with it. Does he want to be cremated or buried? Because it was kind of also that that's a difficult conversation, because you don't want to talk about death with somebody who attempts suicide all the time, but you probably do. Like, that's a whole nother space to talk about, because there's a whole stack of different things going on there. But yeah, I think and because I was semi part of that community, and we had his funeral in the mechanics hall. We didn't have it in a church. We knew that he wanted to be buried, but we didn't know where. And we tried to find him a burial spot in Sydney, which was absolutely impossible. So, it was going through all those hoops, and we had to deal with the coroner for quite a long time as well, because he couldn't be identified for a while. All those kind of different things that happened. I think from being in a death cafe, I was a little bit more prepared for things to not go smoothly or to go awry, but that's okay. Like, I'm working it out as I go along. At least I'm talking about it, and at least I'm trying to help the family. And that death was quite instrumental as well, because then, which is a whole nother story, where his body got stolen from the back of the hearse. Well, the hearse got taken away, and he was in the back of it.
Oh, you're kidding.
That's a whole nother story as well.
Wow.
That is strange things.
Yeah. How does that even happen?
It was very random. It was very random. Do you want me to tell you? It's a short
Of course,
version.
you can't just say all of that and then not follow through with the story, Hayley. Come on.
It's such a strange story, but it ends well. I'll just say that. So we arrived in the morning and met the funeral directors there, and just to get the body into the space, and we were going to go away for a couple of hours and come back. So the hearse backed up, and the two pallbearers were there, and they were just coming out of the hearse to open up the back and get the trolley out to put the coffin on. And at that second, somebody jumped out of the bushes, jumped into the hearse, with the keys were still in the ignition as well. They'll never do that again. And this person drove off with Seth in the coffin in the back of the hearse. And
so literally, someone literally stole the hearse.
Yes, and we were all. There was only a few of us there. There was, 3 people from the funeral home, my husband at the time, and I, and Ramona, my daughter. And the florist was just arriving with the flowers, and she's like, "What's happened?" And we're like, "It's gone that way." And she's like, "It's okay. It's a dead end that way." And so I'm calling,
my goodness.
Yeah, I'm calling the cops.
The pun.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I'm calling the cops, and I'm like, I couldn't get the words out. I'm like, somebody's stolen the hearse, or somebody's stolen the hearse, and Seth's dead. And they're like, what? He's killed him? And I'm like, no, he's already dead. Something like that.
Oh, Hayley, that is so unfortunate.
I know. But meanwhile, the funeral director was standing there, tears down almost tears down their face, going, oh my God, this has never happened to me before. And meanwhile, Tobias, my husband, had driven off after the hearse. And in my head, because I saw the person briefly and it looked like a younger person, and in my head I was thinking, oh my god, like, is this person on ice? Is Tobias going to get stabbed?
Yeah.
Is there going to be another like death on our hands? Like, what's going to happen? Anyway, so it was a dead end. Luckily he did go that way and not the Greater Western Highway, because he could have gone that way.
Yeah,
But he went the
wow.
other way. And at the end of the street was a boys' school, and they were all out playing rugby. And this hearse
Oh,
had kind of tried to get onto the oval, but not quite got there, and stalled. And Tobias jumped out of his car and opened the door, and we went, "What the hell are you doing?" And this person just looked up at him and said, "I don't know where I am." And it turned out that the cops arrived pretty quickly. It turned out that this person was quite young, in his 30s, but he had dementia. And he'd
oh
just
no.
moved 2 days before into a facility that was really quite close to where we were living, and he escaped and nobody could find him. And he'd been living in
Oh,
the bushes. Like, he got quite far. We were down in Wentworth Falls and he'd walked quite far, but he just saw an opportunity for a car. He must have seen the keys and just got in it and ran off. So anyway, the
oh
police were like, "Do you want to
wow.
make charges?" And we're like, "No, if he's okay, then, and everything's okay." And, brought Seth back, put him in then we went home and had a drink, and then I was like, "Can I please put this on Facebook? It's just so weird."
You couldn't have written a script like that, really.
I can't even remember what I posted, but my friend in Darwin worked for the ABC, and so he rang me and went, "Can I do a story?" And I'm like, "Okay, but don't name any names." Like, of the funeral directors or anything.
Oh, yeah, that would have been very attractive for them.
Yeah. So we spent like that night, like, and the funeral was fine. It all went well. And then later on that night, I spent like saving screen grabs of it went viral across all the, different newspapers across the world. And I was taking screenshots of all the different images that people were using. Like in Ghana, they had an image of a gold gilded coffin, going into the hearse. And then in India, there was like a hearse in front of a big ship at the port. And like the story got a little bit skewed.
Wow, they got really creative, didn't they?
Yes.
Have you ever done an art piece on that story, Hayley?
I haven't. And I think the reason is because it's not, now that I'm separated, or, I'm no longer with my husband, it's his family. And I kind of feel like it's his story in a way. He's happy for me to relay the story, but
Yeah.
I kind of think, we'll just leave it as that. And yeah.
Yeah, going viral was good enough.
Oh, yeah. And it was like some strange joke, that Seth had pulled, for us all. That was what we were all talking about at the funeral. It was like, did he do this? Did he set this up?
That's amazing. Now, we know that art can be a really good way in which to actually challenge people's thoughts and also tackle, difficult subjects. And we know that your focus has certainly moved to death as time has gone on. So tell me, what sort of changes have you seen when people interact with your installations, or have you seen any sort of behaviour change? Tell me a little bit about that around your work.
I have, definitely. And I think because I've been in this community here in Castlemaine for nearly 9 years now, it's only 9 or 10,000 people here. So I feel like over that period of time, like, people have gotten used to me being the kind of deathy person that they can stop in the street and ask a question. But as far as artwork goes, there's a whole bunch of other artists who work with the theme of death too, and it's always been there since time started, hasn't it? Like,
Yeah.
but when I first moved to Castlemaine, I had a studio at the Mill, which is a really highly visited tourist precinct in Castlemaine. So it's full of makers and artisans, and there's a whole, people like the ice creamery makes their own ice cream and sells the ice cream. The Austrian cafe makes their own coffee, sells coffee. So there's a whole bunch of artists too who sell wares. I don't know what the hell I was selling, but I was selling me and a few other artworks. So I had it set up as a studio. I had other people's artworks actually in there. And the idea was, I think I was working on a lot of my ceramics work at the time. And so I had my door open on the weekends and people could just walk in and see me working on artworks. But as soon as they walked into the space, straight away you'd see, well, a wicker coffin in the space, which was, something that just people hadn't really seen. That's more in the news now than ever, more in the media or as an option. But at that point, they were pretty new. And I'd borrowed it off one of the funeral homes to have in there. And I also had one of my artworks, which was I did a residency in Senegal for a few months. And I did a whole photographic series about mainly dead things that I'd come across. And there was this huge billboard behind me that was a dead dolphin. Anyway, so people would walk in, tourists particularly on the weekend, and go, oh, and they'd either like, are they too far in to walk back out again? Or have they kind of committed, I go, hi. And
this isn't the ice creamery I thought I was walking
yeah,
into.
yeah, exactly. So I think I could kind of make people feel comfortable and welcome pretty quickly. And I mean, you lock eyes with somebody who's just sitting there as well. So you've walked into the space. But sometimes I did get families who came in with young children, and they would, I'd say about half and half when I first opened. Some people would just walk straight out again. They just didn't want their kids to see anything. Like I had skulls and I had a rack of Halloween outfits as well. But yeah, I think it might have been a little bit too confrontational for some people, and I get that because it's you're there for the day or the weekend. You don't want to talk to your kids about death. Fair enough. But a lot of the times I'd be doing projects in there where people could interact with me too. Like I did a weaving project, and it was about the children who had drowned during the gold rush in the botanical gardens, which is across the road. So people would sit down with me and weave, and I'd tell them about a little bit of that history. And the most successful project I did in there with engaging particularly children, though, was when kids walked in, I gave them a big black marker pen and I got them to write on the concrete floor, and it was for adults too, of course, but it was like write down a name of somebody who's died that whether it be a grandparent or a pet, or if somebody hasn't died who's close to you, there might be, I had David Bowie written down a few times. So, there was options. But I really found that was a fantastic way to engage kids and parents with their children too, because then they'd have that conversation like, oh, well, should we write down, Nana's name down, and kids just being allowed to use a big black marker pen and write on the ground. They just totally got into it. And, of course, because my daughter would always be doing it as well. And she'd think about some other goldfish that we had that she could write, every time she came in. But she'd be drawing pictures.
Because anyone who has had goldfish knows you'll have a long list of names.
Yeah, exactly. There was some random names in there, but so it became this collective memorial,
Wow.
and it was really beautiful. I loved it, and it filled up. I was only there for 8 months because the council decided to up the rates 300% or something, because it was becoming such a money-making thing for all the artists that they thought they'd kind of make some money. So, as an advocate, it was really an advocacy space more than anything. It wasn't really a financially viable thing for me to have. But yeah, that project was really special. And when the real estate agent made me paint over it when I moved out, I was like, oh my God. I got some great photos though. But yeah, that was fantastic. I loved that work.
So, Hayley, you've actually positioned yourself in a lot of spaces in relation to advocacy, and you're a member of a few different organisations. So, Australian Home Funeral Alliance.
Yeah, I've written the Victorian section for their website, but I'm not a member yet.
And then, and then the Natural Death Advocacy Network.
Yes.
You're a member of that.
I'm on the
committee. Tell me a little bit about, why is it important to you and what motivates you to be part of this? And also, you host a program called Dead Air, and that's actually on the local radio station up there every Monday, is it?
Yep.
Yeah, so what makes you, taken you from, those times up in the Blue Mountains where you met, Kerry, and you started sort of being involved in the death cafes to where you are now, where you are actually very much at the forefront of changing the face and talking about death literacy in Australia?
I think another ingredient in my journey into this area of advocacy is being a librarian too. So when I moved to Castlemaine, I ended up getting a job at the local library, and I think that became a space as well for talking to people. Like, I'm a front of house kind of a person, so that kind of inspired me as well to kind of get the message out to the community, because that was an ideal space as well as the studio to meet people and to become part of the community and engage. You've got a captive audience there who've come to you again, Yeah, so I guess that would have been instrumental as well in me deciding to be more active in various groups that were established, because I needed that information too to impart on my community. So I became quite interested in environmentally friendly ways to dispose of your body. And I decided to do a few talks in the different libraries in the regional areas, because Castlemaine Library is also part of the Goldfields Libraries, and that extends down to Gisborne and way up to Boort and Pyramid Hill in the regions, which are a bit more remote. So I did a few presentations one year for Dying to Know Day, and they were received so well. I talked about alkaline hydrolysis, water cremation, natural organic reduction, human composting, and natural burial. And so I'd been a member of the Natural Death Advocacy Network when it started. It was a bit silent for a little bit, and then it kind of pepped up. And when it pepped up, I decided that I'd jump on board and get onto the committee and learn. It's all about learning more, and also, finding people with the same kind of ethos as yourself. And when you kind of just a one woman person, in your community, and sure, there's people that you can talk to about death, but for all that really juicy information, you really need to have those peers that you can rely on and talk to about things that are happening. And I guess meeting Beck Lyons is been amazing, because she's just a wealth of information and she's so personable. And so she's part or the chair of the Natural Death Advocacy Network. It's a way for me to stay on top of what's happening around, particularly Australia, and so that I can keep up to date. Like, I love going to workshops and seminars and festivals all to do with death. I try and do all that kind of stuff all the time. And I'm always putting myself in publications or, trying to get the word out in different ways as well. And I guess radio became one of those ways too. One of the things that you do when you move to Castlemaine is you realize that I think most people move here because it's a really creative town and it has a really fantastic live music scene and a lot of venues, and yeah, it's just pumping. It reminded me a lot of Darwin, actually. As soon as I moved here, I was like, oh, I found my home. But one of the things that happens is you end up listening to Main FM, which is our community radio station. And I always tend to do that wherever I live anyway. I kind of try and tune into what's happening locally. But Main FM's actually it has a great subscribership and membership, and people are really invested in it. And that's what I really love about this town as well, is that people are really invested in the town, which I didn't find in the Blue Mountains at all. I think that, for me, it felt like everybody was focused on Sydney and all the interesting people were doing things in Sydney. Whereas in Castlemaine, it's like we don't feel the need to go to Melbourne to do that. We've got everything happening here. Like, it's really hard to get to Melbourne because there's so much happening.
Yep, that is very true.
So Main FM has become like another community to be involved in. And there's over 70 shows on the grid, and that can have one or two people in it. So it's really active, and there's all sorts of things from music to talk shows. So when my space closed down at the mill, I was like, how am I going to get that feeling again of like engaging with people and really thinking about my practice as a socially engaged practice? Like, how am I going to do that? I don't have time to be making work, because I have to work full time. I'm solo parenting, and on these committees, it's like, what am I going to do? So I already had a few friends and I'd already done a few interviews with other friends on Main FM about my practice or whatever, death related stuff. And I thought, oh, maybe I need to have a show just about death and dying. And I put it to the program manager and to the committee, and they're like, heck yes, do it. So even though it feels like, it's live every Monday, because I've just gone back. I had a bit of a break because of my work commitments, but it's a little bit different because it's one way. So I'm talking to, people out there in the ether, whether they're listening to it streaming or listening live on their wireless. It still feels like I'm engaging because I also edit it and upload it later so that people like the millennials can listen to it later, or people that can't listen to it on a Monday morning, like a podcast. So it feels like it's one way, but I do get a lot of texts in, and I get a lot of feedback through social media that people are listening. I get a lot of people contacting me with suggestions for interviews or for articles, because one of the things I love doing on it is actually reading articles on it, because it's like reading to adults. Like, who gets to listen to that, like,
that is great. Yeah.
And when I was working in the men's prison here, we've got 3 prisons in Castlemaine, so that's a big employer. But I was working in the medium security prison for a little bit, and I know that some of the prisoners were listening to Main FM. They tuned in. There wasn't many locals who were in there, but they'd kind of come across Main FM because they're not allowed internet, so they can't listen to streaming. So it's live radio for them. And so it means it's accessible. Live radio is accessible to a whole bunch of people that you might not engage with. Like, there's people who are homeless, who are living in cars. They can tune into a radio station. There's, people who have different disabilities, who might not have access to print, they can't read media. And the prisoners, like, there's a whole bunch of people that you kind of don't think about and people that can't afford. There's plenty. Being a librarian here in Castlemaine has made me realize that actually our literacy rate is quite low in this shire. You feel like you're in a little bit of a bubble of all this awesomeness in Castlemaine, but if you just reach out a little bit further, there's a whole bunch of kids that are missing out on good reading, So, and
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of people that can't afford to have internet or can't afford to access that. So, I mean, libraries are really important for that, for them to be able to come in and use free internet, or, even just to be around books. So
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a lot of great things about live radio, and I love the idea that somebody, can just tune in and unexpectedly hear me talking about, I don't know, anything like, natural burial or necrophilia, like, know, it kind
Yeah,
of,
you certainly don't get that on mainstream radio, Hayley.
yeah, I did a Valentine's special on it one year.
Of course you did. Now, there is another artwork that when I think of your oeuvre of work that you've got,
Mhm.
and that is really the role of ritual that plays quite a central sort of aspect to two of your, say, they're performance pieces, and the ones that I'm thinking of are the ones where you use the cooling bed.
Ah,
I find
yes.
that fascinating. So if you
Yeah.
could explain that to our audience, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so a couple of times I've hired a cooling bed off death doulas. Cooling beds are a contraption that you put underneath, like a big bit of metal that's hooked up to a generator that freezes, that you put under a dead body to slow down decomposition. And the reason that you would do that is if you're waiting for family to arrive because they want to spend time with the person who's died, or it's really, really hot day and you do, because you can have your person at home for as long as you like in Victoria. It's usually around average of 3 days that people have had enough. But yeah, so there's other ways that you can, I mean, you can just use ice as well. Somebody can run down the road and grab bags of ice. But I actually really love the mechanics of this instrument. And yeah, so I've hired it a couple of times. And my favorite time that I used it in a performance was when at Bendigo Art Gallery there was a beautiful exhibition called Gothic Beauty, I think it was called. And they built me a little room in the middle of the gallery that was completely dark and black. And I set up the cooling bed on a bed, and I had a black quilt over the top of it. And I actually dressed up in my Victorian mourning gear as well. And I didn't have times or anything that people could come in. I just kind of winged it again, like I normally do. What people would do is come in, and I'd just say, welcome, you can lie down on the bed. What I want you to do, I had a script that I read. It was very short, but it was like, I wanted them to consider their own mortality and really think about that when they're lying down on this cold plate, because this is something that you'll never get to experience, like when you're dead. Yeah, I kind of explained briefly what it was, and you won't experience this when you're dead. And it's something you possibly, this is the only time you'll experience it when you're alive as well. So here's a really great kind of liminal space for you to really consider your own mortality and your death, and just lie as long as you like and listen to me read murder ballads. So I had a whole list of songs that I'd printed out, and I just read them because I obviously like reading to adults. But
I am picking up on that theme. Yep.
yeah, and they could lie as long as they liked. It was actually quite hot time of year, I think, as well. Oh no, that was another time I did it in Canberra. But oh my god, of 40-degree days, and I could not get people off that bed. Like I had like constant stream of hundreds of people at this festival. Anyway, that's another story. But yeah,
Especially
so
in Canberra. Oof.
yeah, so yeah, it was a quite an intimate space, and it was very simple, but yeah, and I just kept going. Like I think I did it for like I don't know, 4 hours or something non-stop.
And tell me, how did people react, Hayley, when they lay down? Like, what were the sort of things that you were seeing in people and what they were experiencing?
Most people did what they were told. So it's funny because it's kind of, you're telling somebody to do like lie in a very vulnerable position, I guess, and they don't know what exactly I'm going to do. But it's in an art gallery. That's the other thing that's different. So people come to a gallery and they know they're going to engage with art. It's very different from when you set up something like that in a motel. So
Yeah. Wow. Have you done that before?
yeah, in Canberra.
Oh, it was in a motel.
It wasn't a motel. Well, it was more like a hotel. It was a hotel, but it was kind of felt like a motel. And that was part of a bigger festival.
And what was the difference between the two? Were people more reticent to actually lie down in a motel?
Yes, it was on the bed that I was sleeping on at nighttime, and I'd put it on the bed during the day.
That's a little bit too close to your art, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was like a double, like it was a townhouse kind of hotel. So it was an art festival, but there's a whole stack of all sorts of things happening all the time, and people did engage with it, but also at the same time it was so busy that I didn't get to talk to everyone. So I didn't really get good feedback from that experience, but I could hear people talking about it when I was walking around the next day, like having experienced it. So as far as I'm concerned, my job is done. Like, people are talking about it. They knew what it was for, like in real life. But when I was in a gallery setting, I guess people are more in tune to something peculiar going on, or it's in an art context. It's like, the last work I did for Radical Fields in Glen Lyon this year. Radical Fields is curated by Ryan Kennedy, and he lives out there, and his friend's property is just this massive paddock. And he got, I think it was 6 artists to do work in the paddock, and it was just for a day event. And so I dug a grave, and this is kind of a similar work in a way. What I wanted to do, it was called 750 millimeters under, because lots of people know the 6 feet under kind of concept, but not everybody knows the fact that for a natural burial, you only need that amount of soil above you legally because it's about decomposing quickly and going into the earth. And anyway, so I thought, hilariously, I rocked up in the morning going with my shovel because Ryan had said to me, oh yeah, the soil's great, like on this side, like where I was. On the other side, it's a bit rocky, but you get this far down and it's rock. And I was like, oh my God, what is this artwork going to be for one day? But lucky for me, there was a digger, like a guy, the local guys, who was already helping another artist who was doing soil samples with a borer.
Oh, wow. You were so lucky.
Oh my God. See, this is me winging it all the time. It'll come together, no worries. Anyway, James ended up digging the grave for me, thank goodness. But that work was fantastic, and I got the best feedback from people, and it was unexpected as well. So I got down in it, like before everybody came. Like, I got there quite early and it got dark, and it was beautiful in there. Like, you laid down, it was cool. It was in summer, the heat of summer. It was cool and it was quiet. And all you could hear was the bees slowly going across every now and again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was so beautiful. And amazing. It was like a James Turrell artwork of just blue colour in a rectangle above you. So again, it was kind of like I got people, if they wanted to get into the grave and again consider their own mortality. And while they were down there, I would talk to them about natural burial. So it was more of an advocacy kind of role, but it was, it's all part of my art practice. I mean, I consider the radio show part of my art practice as well. But yeah, so Radical Fields, like, everybody had a fantastic time in the grave.
So what's next for you, Hayley?
Well, I'm doing Radical Fields again, but I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do this time around. I haven't quite thought it through yet. I do have a few ideas. I've got a few ideas for shroud artwork, but I'm just need to, because I like to stay true to my word in a way. I've got some beautiful patterns for shrouds, but I'd like to put my own photography onto the shrouds, but I'd like the ink to be kosher. So I'd like the shroud to be an artwork, but also something that somebody could buy to use to be buried in a natural burial site. So I want it to be able to decompose well and not be, bad ink product that's, I'm not sure. Like, yeah, I've had that idea for a while. I've had lots of ideas, but it's like when you work full time, I'm kind of, yeah, I don't know what I'm doing. I've got different ideas. Art is kind of, the radio show is sustaining me in that creative way for a little bit. But I have been talking to some fellow independent death workers who I'm very good friends with in Melbourne, particularly. And I don't know, I think there's a bit of a critical mass happening at the moment where people in the industry are starting to realize that we are already and can be independent funeral consultants in a way. Like, we don't actually need a physical space. If we're talking to families or people about family-led funerals and home-based care in end of life, all these kind of things, there might be something that I consider doing and leaving full-time work. Planning funerals are events and hopefully, fun events for some of them. They're not always fun, but I know venues and I know bands and I know a lot of creative people and, I know a band called Dead, who come from Castlemaine, and friends with them. It's like I could help create a really fantastic funeral for people in the community, but also empower them to do it themselves as well. And I think I think the timing's kind of right. We have 2 funeral homes here in Castlemaine. One of them has just been taken over by a major corporation. So I can now only tell people that one of them is family owned and run. And for the last few years, people have come to me and they don't want those conventional funerals that they go to quite often. And so I've been suggesting other funeral places that might be able to help them out that are further afield. So a lot of my community are starting to look outside the community, and I think it's the right time for me and we've got a really strong death doula community here in Central Victoria. I think there's a real joy for that compassionate communities model, and I think we're already doing it here really quite well. But to kind of link everyone together in the end of life space and the death space, like, I think it's going to be a natural thing for me to do. And I have those fantastic peers in Melbourne too, and fantastic funeral homes outside of Castlemaine that will really help me, I think, do that. So I think that's where I'm going to end up, but it's just a matter of like trying to work out financially, how that might happen.
Well, that sounds like we're definitely going to be watching this space and seeing what that evolves into, Hayley.
Yeah, me too.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
We could listen to Dead Air.
We'll be putting a link into Dead Air, don't you worry, so they can certainly tune in and certainly to NDAN so they can learn more information too. So
NDAN's like a wealth of information with their resources now. Like, there's some really good information there.
Yeah, there's some great information. So we'll definitely include that in the links in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for being with us today, Hayley.
No worries. It was lovely to speak to you.